The wind carried a faint, sickly scent through the village of Braxton, heavy with decay. In the distance, the bells tolled another death, the mournful sound swallowed by the rising fog. Alice Braithwaite stood at the window of her small cottage, watching as the shadow of the cart passed by, carrying yet another body to the mass graves. She counted 3 today, far too many for a village this small. Outside, the streets lay eerily quiet. The usual clamor of market stalls and chattering children had been replaced by an uneasy silence. Even the crows, those harbingers of misfortune, had grown too fat to move, feasting on the flesh of the dead. But it wasn't the plague that weighed heaviest on Alice's mind tonight. It was the figure she had seen the night before, moving silently through the mist. She had heard the stories for months. Tales of an eerie, bird-like man seen at the edge of villages just before death swept through. His face hidden behind a long-beaked mask, and his eyes, if they were eyes at all, said to gleam red beneath the moonlight. The children called him the Crow Doctor, but the elders had other names for him. The Plague Doctor, the Reaper, Death's Keeper. Alice hadn't believed it at first, of course. Superstition thrived in times like these, when the world seemed to unravel at the seams. But last night, just before the fever had claimed old Mr. Holloway, Alice had seen the figure herself, standing beneath the lamplight at the crossroads, watching. She had blinked, and he was gone. "Alice, you need rest," came a voice from behind her. Her mother, bedridden for days, lay pale and thin beneath the blankets. Her eyes, once bright, had dulled to a grayish hue. The sickness was setting in, though Alice hadn't dared admit it to herself yet. "I'm fine," Alice replied softly, turning away from the window. "Just thinking." Her mother gave a weak smile. "You're always thinking too much. Come, sit with me." Alice moved to her side, pulling up a wooden chair beside the bed. She took her mother's hand, cold and frail in her own. In the distance, the bell rang again, the sound creeping in like a shadow. As night fell, the fog thickened outside, creeping through the village like a living thing. Alice kept her vigil by the window, watching for any movement in the streets. The villagers had boarded up their homes, barricading themselves against the sickness and something else. Fear slithered through the air, wrapping around the heart of every person who dared to step outside. Then, just past midnight, she saw him again. At first, Alice thought it was a trick of the light. The figure emerged from the mist, his black cloak blending with the night, only the long, curved beak of his mask distinguishing him from the shadows. He walked slowly, deliberately, his presence unnatural, almost spectral. She held her breath, not daring to move as he passed down the street, his gloved hand brushing against the doorways. He paused at each one as if marking them, as if deciding. And then he stopped, right in front of her cottage. Alice's heart pounded in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to scream, to flee, but her feet were frozen to the floor. She could only watch as the plague doctor stood there, still as a statue, his head tilting slightly toward the window. Though she couldn't see his eyes through the mask, she felt him staring directly at her. Then, without a sound, he moved on, disappearing into the fog as quickly as he had come. The room felt colder now, the air thick with dread. Alice shuddered and backed away from the window. She had heard the stories. When he marked a home, death followed within days. "Alice," her mother's voice was weak, barely a whisper. "Who is it? Who's there?" "No one," Alice lied, her voice trembling. "It's nothing, just a shadow." But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The plague doctor had come to Braxton. and he had seen her. The days that followed blurred into a suffocating haze of sickness and dread. Alice barely slept, afraid of what might lurk outside her door, afraid of her own mind. Since that night, she had caught only fleeting glimpses of the plague doctor, always at a distance, always moving silently through the streets like a grim omen. And with each sighting, another life was claimed. The sickness had taken her mother 2 days after the figure passed their cottage. Alice had sat by her side as the fever burned through her frail body, the tremors shaking her bones until the very last breath escaped her lips. She had died with her eyes wide open, fixed on the ceiling as though she saw something Alice could not. A cruel irony settled over Alice's home. The midwife who had brought life into the world now lived in the shadow of death. Braxton itself had become a graveyard. Doors and windows were boarded shut, save for the groans of the dying and the shuffle of the infected. The streets, once bustling with merchants and travelers, had grown still, like the eerie calm before a storm. No one dared leave their homes unless it was for burial or burning. Alice could no longer ignore the stories. She had seen the plague doctor, and soon after her mother was dead. But no one else seemed to notice the silent visitor, or at least they refused to speak of him, preferring to blame their misfortune on the will of God. Alice, however, knew better. The village priest had died a week ago, and no prayers had saved him from the fate they all feared. On the 3rd day after her mother's passing, Alice decided she could no longer sit idly by, waiting for death to find her. It was nearing dusk when she stepped outside, the air cool and thick with the scent of damp earth and rot. She pulled her shawl tightly around her shoulders and made her way to the village square, where a handful of men still gathered to exchange grim news. She approached old Samuel Wainwright, the village undertaker, who had seen more bodies in the past month than in the whole of his 50 years. His face was gaunt, skin hanging loosely around his jaw, his eyes sunken and hollow. "Samuel," Alice began, her voice unsteady. "Have you seen him? The one they speak of? The plague doctor?" Samuel looked at her for a long moment, his lips pressing into a thin line. For a second, Alice feared he would dismiss her question, but instead he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I've seen him. Not just once. He's been here before. Years ago." Alice felt a chill crawl down her spine. "Before?" Samuel nodded gravely. "When the pox came 20 years back, my father spoke of him too. Said he marked the houses just like now. Anyone he touched, they didn't last long." "But what is he?" Alice asked, her pulse quickening. "A man? A spirit?" "No man, that's for sure," Samuel muttered, casting a wary glance over his shoulder, as if the figure might appear at any moment. "He's something else. A curse, maybe. Or worse. But mark my words, girl. He doesn't come to heal. He comes to collect." The weight of Samuel's words settled heavily on her. She had seen it with her own eyes. Every home the plague doctor passed had suffered losses, hers included. But what did he want? Why did he choose some homes over others? As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the square, Alice resolved to find out. She had lost her mother, but she would not lose herself to this terror. If there was some link between the plague doctor and the deaths that followed, she needed to understand it. And if the villagers were too frightened to act, then she would have to face him alone. That night, Alice did not stay inside. Instead, she waited in the dark, hidden behind the thick trunks of the trees that lined the road. The fog rolled in as it always did, blanketing the village in a cold, damp shroud. And then, as if summoned by her silent resolve, he appeared. plague doctor stepped into view, his black cloak rippling in the faint breeze, his beaked mask a pale, ghastly shape against the gloom. He moved with eerie grace, his gloved hands trailing along the doors of the cottages, leaving something unseen in his wake. Alice's heart pounded in her chest as she watched him pause in front of the baker's house, his head tilting toward the door. The house had been quiet for days. She had assumed the family had fled, but now she wasn't so sure. The plague doctor lingered, his presence almost expectant, as though waiting for the inevitable. For a long moment Alice watched, paralyzed by a strange mixture of terror and fascination. Then, just as silently as he had come, the plague doctor continued down the street, disappearing into the mist. Alice stepped out from the shadows, her resolve hardening. Tomorrow she would find out what he left behind. The morning light did little to chase away the fear that clung to Alice. The village was already beginning to wake, if you could call the muffled groans of the dying and the rustling of the sick waking. Alice's heart pounded as she stood before the baker's cottage, its windows shuttered and its door closed tight. No one had left the house since the plague doctor's visit last night. She had watched him market, watched him pause longer than he had at any other home. What had he left behind? With a deep breath, Alice knocked, though she knew in her bones no one would answer. When the silence dragged on, she tried the door, and to her surprise, it creaked open. Inside, the air was thick with the acrid smell of rot and something else, something foul, almost sulfuric. The once cozy home was dim, dust gathering on the floor as if the life within had been snuffed out long ago. Alice called out for the baker, for his wife, for their 2 young children, but only silence greeted her. Her stomach churned as she moved deeper into the house, her eyes scanning for any sign of life, but instead of finding the family, her gaze fell on the floor near the hearth, where strange markings had been etched into the wood. Black, charred symbols spiraled out from a central point, some of them unfamiliar, others eerily resembling the shapes of birds, crows, or perhaps vultures. Alice crouched down, her fingers hovering over the burnt wood. These markings, they looked too deliberate to be the result of an accident. They almost looked placed. She recoiled, her skin prickling. The plague doctor hadn't just passed this house. He had done something here. Whatever this was, it was more than disease, more than death. Alice's breath came quicker as the realization took root in her mind. This was a curse, a dark, ancient one. The markings, the strange smell, the suffocating silence. They were signs of something beyond the plague, something supernatural. She was about to stand when a faint, rasping sound came from the far corner of the room. Her heart lurched as she spun around, her eyes straining to see in the dim light. There, lying crumpled in the shadows, was the baker's wife. Her skin was pallid, her cheeks sunken, and her breathing was shallow, barely a whisper. Alice rushed to her side, kneeling down and placing a trembling hand on her forehead. She was burning up, her eyes rolling back as she muttered incoherently. "Alice?" the woman rasped, her voice barely audible. Alice froze. The woman recognized her. How Alice couldn't know, but the recognition in her weak eyes was unmistakable. She leaned in closer, trying to catch her fading words. He mocked us," the woman whispered, her breath ragged. He took them, my children, gone." Alice's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? Took them?" The woman's eyes fluttered, the light within them dimming by the second. They were alive, but he touched them, and they changed. Changed? Alice echoed, her voice shaking. How? What did he do to them? But it was too late. The woman's head lolled to the side, her body going limp, her final breath slipping away in a shallow exhale. She was gone. Another soul claimed by the plague, or something worse. Alice stared at the woman's lifeless form, her mind racing. The plague doctor wasn't just spreading the disease. He was transforming his victims, taking them for a purpose she couldn't yet fathom. The markings on the floor, the sulfuric stench, the strange behavior of the children. It all pointed to something far darker than the plague. He wasn't just a harbinger of death. He was a collector. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The house felt colder, as if the walls themselves were closing in around her. She rose to her feet, her pulse quickening. There was something more in this house, something she could feel but couldn't see. It was as if the air itself was watching her. She fled from the house, her heart pounding in her ears as she burst into the open air, gulping down deep breaths. The fog had started to lift, but the weight of what she had uncovered pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. Alice knew now what the plague doctor was doing, or at least part of it. He wasn't just marking homes. He was marking people, cursing them, turning them into something else. The sickness was merely the beginning. The village had no idea what was truly happening, and time was running out. The plague doctor had returned for a reason, and whatever dark force he served, it was growing stronger with each soul he collected. But why? Why now? And what would happen when he had taken enough? Alice didn't have the answers yet, but she knew one thing for certain. The plague doctor would come again, and next time, she had to be ready. The fog clung to the narrow streets like a living thing, thickening as the sun fell behind the rooftops. Alice moved swiftly, her heart racing as she followed the winding path toward the outskirts of Braxton. There, hidden behind the rows of crumbling cottages, lay the forest, a dark expanse of twisted trees that villagers avoided even in daylight. She had no choice but to go there now. Old Samuel's words echoed in her mind. He's been here before. The plague doctor wasn't just a visitor to Braxton. He had roots here, deep and ancient. If she was going to stop him, she had to find out where he came from. The villagers whispered about strange happenings in the woods, about ancient ruins buried deep within the trees, remnants of something older than their town. Superstitions had kept them away, but Alice no longer had the luxury of fear. She had seen the markings, heard the dying woman's final words, and now she needed answers. As she stepped into the forest, the air turned colder, the branches overhead curling together like skeletal hands, blotting out the moon. The path twisted before her, barely visible through the dense underbrush, and yet something in her gut urged her onward. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was survival. The village seemed emptier than ever. As she passed the houses, their windows dark and doors sealed, it was as if Braxton had already died, but the bodies hadn't realized it yet. Inside her own cottage, the fire had long since gone out. Only shadows remained, the walls echoing with memories of her mother's last days. She slumped into a chair, her limbs heavy with exhaustion, but sleep eluded her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the plague doctor's hollow mask, the symbols and the strange power that emanated from him. And worse, she saw her mother's face, twisted in pain, as if crying out for help from beyond. Alice couldn't bear it anymore. She needed answers, something to anchor herself in reality, something to explain the curse she had uncovered. Desperation gnawed at her mind. There was one person left who might know more. Old Eliza Drummond, the village healer. Eliza lived alone on the edge of the village, her cottage hidden by a dense thicket of trees. Most villagers avoided her, wary of her knowledge of herbs and charms. They said she dabbled in things better left untouched, but now Alice had no choice. If anyone could understand what the plague doctor was or how to stop him, it would be her. The air was still and heavy as Alice made her way through the undergrowth toward Eliza's home. The trees around her whispered, the wind carrying a faint, eerie song that made her skin crawl. She knocked on the healer's door, and after a long pause, it creaked open, revealing Eliza's sharp, weathered face. "What brings you here, Alice Braithwaite?" Eliza asked, her voice gravelly yet calm. Her eyes, sharp as needles, studied Alice's pale, trembling form. "I've seen him," Alice whispered, stepping inside. "The plague doctor. He's real. He's not just here to collect the dead. He's doing something else. Something unnatural." Eliza's expression remained unreadable, though her lips tightened into a thin line. She motioned for Alice to sit by the hearth, where a small fire crackled, giving the room a dim, flickering glow. The air inside smelled of dried herbs and earth, a stark contrast to the rot and sickness that plagued the rest of Braxton. "You've seen him up close, then," Eliza murmured, stirring a pot of something thick and herbal. "Few survived that encounter." Alice nodded, her throat tight. "He marked my house. My mother died after he passed. And the Baker's family, they were changed before they died." Eliza was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. "He doesn't just take lives, Alice. He takes something far deeper. When he marks a house, he takes the souls of those inside, transforming them. They become twisted, incomplete, shadows of themselves lost to his curse." Alice's heart sank as the healer's words settled over her. Her suspicions were true. The sickness wasn't the only thing killing the villagers. The plague doctor was turning them into something else, something worse than death. "Why?" Alice asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why does he do it?" Eliza's eyes darkened. "It's an old curse, older than the plague itself. The one you call the plague doctor was once a man, long ago, during the Black Death. But he made a pact with something ancient, something beyond our understanding. He became its vessel, a collector of souls, feeding this dark force in exchange for immortality. The mask he wears binds him to this curse." Alice's breath caught in her throat. "The mask," she murmured, recalling the way he had hesitated when she struck him with it. "Is that the key? Can the curse be broken?" Eliza's lips tightened. "Perhaps. But breaking such a curse is dangerous. The mask holds his power, but it also holds the souls he's claimed. If you destroy it, you might free them, but you'll also unleash whatever force lies within." A chill swept over Alice. She wasn't just fighting a man or a ghost. She was facing something far older, a dark force that had been growing stronger with each soul the plague doctor claimed. "I have to try," Alice said, her voice steady. "I can't let him take more. He's marked too many and the village is already dying." Eliza met her gaze, her face grave. "Then you must find him again. And this time, you must be ready to face what's inside the mask." Alice nodded, though fear churned in her stomach. She knew the plague doctor wouldn't stop until he had collected every soul in Braxton. And the next time he came for her, she would be waiting. As she left Eliza's cottage and stepped back into the cold night, the weight of what she had to do settled over her like a shroud. The plague doctor was no longer just a distant shadow. He was coming for her, and the only way to stop him was to confront the very thing that gave him power. The mask. Alice's fate was tied to it now, and soon she would face the final reckoning. The night was unnaturally quiet as Alice made her way back to the village, her heart heavy with the burden of what she had learned. The plague doctor had marked her home. He had seen her. After what felt like hours, Alice came upon a clearing. At its center stood a crumbling stone structure, half buried by time and vines. The stones were ancient, worn smooth by centuries of weather and neglect, but Alice could still make out the faint carvings, symbols like the ones she had seen in the baker's house. Spirals, birds, twisted figures that seemed to blur as she looked at them. This place was older than Braxton, older than anything she had ever known. A chill ran down her spine as she approached the entrance. The archway was tall and narrow, its stonework etched with the same cryptic symbols that adorned the ruined walls. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, but beneath that was something else, a metallic tang that clung to the back of her throat. The narrow corridor stretched deep into the earth, sloping downwards as if leading to some forgotten catacomb. Her pulse quickened with every step, the weight of the darkness pressing against her like a shroud. The corridor opened into a wide chamber, lit only by the faint glow of the moon filtering through cracks in the ceiling. At the center of the room stood a stone table, its surface etched with deep grooves. And there, in the middle of the table, lay an object that made Alice's blood run cold, a beaked mask, identical to the one worn by the plague doctor. She moved closer, her breath catching in her throat as she examined the mask. It was old, much older than the plague that now ravaged Braxton. The leather was cracked and worn, the beak chipped at the edges, but there was something deeply sinister about it. This mask wasn't just a relic. It was a symbol, a tool for something far darker than medicine. As she reached out to touch it, a sharp sound echoed through the chamber, freezing her in place. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approached from the corridor behind her. Alice's heart leapt into her throat as she spun around, her eyes searching the darkness. From the shadows, the plague doctor emerged. He moved with the same eerie grace she had seen in the village, his long cloak brushing the stone floor as he approached. His beaked mask glinted in the dim light, the hollow eyes staring directly at her. But now, here in this ancient place, Alice could feel the power that radiated from him, a dark, suffocating force that made the air heavy and thick. You're not human," Alice whispered, her voice trembling. It wasn't a question. She already knew the answer. The plague doctor tilted his head, the eerie gesture sending a shiver down her spine. His gloved hand extended slowly toward her, and she recoiled, pressing herself against the stone wall. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Why are you doing this?" He remained silent, his head still cocked at that unnatural angle. Then, as if answering her unspoken question, he gestured to the mask on the table. The symbols on the walls, the strange carvings, the rituals, it all began to make sense. This wasn't about healing or even the plague. He was something ancient, a force that had existed long before disease had names, a collector of souls. Alice felt the weight of her own mortality pressing down on her. If she didn't escape, she would become another mark, another victim, another soul added to his collection. Without warning, the plague doctor lunged toward her, his movements swift and unnatural. Alice stumbled backward, her hand grazing the stone table. She grabbed the mask, the very thing that had started this nightmare, and flung it at him. The mask struck him squarely in the chest, and for the first time, the plague doctor hesitated. A strange sound filled the chamber, like the low rasp of air escaping a crypt. He recoiled, his figure wavering as if caught between two worlds. Seizing the moment, Alice bolted toward the corridor, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't look back as she ran, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the ancient halls. The plague doctor's presence lingered behind her, growing fainter with each step. By the time she emerged into the forest, the air was cold and still, the moon high above her. She fell to her knees, gasping for breath, her mind reeling from the encounter. The plague doctor wasn't just a man. He wasn't even a ghost. He was a curse, a force that fed on death, on fear, and on the souls of the marked. And he wasn't finished with her yet. Alice stumbled back to her cottage, her mind a tangled web of fear and confusion. The encounter in the stone chamber haunted her, each detail, each symbol burned into her thoughts. She had seen the plague doctor falter when she threw the mask at him, but it hadn't been enough to stop him. The dark force he embodied had gripped her soul like a cold hand, and she knew it wouldn't let go easily. The fog thickened around her, swallowing up the familiar streets and turning the cottages into looming, shapeless masses. In her hand, she clutched a small bundle wrapped in cloth, charms and herbs that Eliza had given her. For protection, the healer had said, though Alice knew they wouldn't be enough. Nothing could truly protect her from what was coming. The plague doctor would return tonight. She could feel it in the air, in the way the village seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable. The final reckoning was near, and Alice would be ready. She made her way to the town square, the center of Braxton, where the few remaining villagers had left lanterns burning, though the streets remained deserted. As she stood beneath the flickering light, she glanced down at the mask she had taken from the stone chamber. The leather was worn, the beak chipped, but she could feel the dark power pulsing from it, a tether to something far older than she could comprehend. Destroying it would free the souls trapped within, but it would also unleash the darkness. Alice was out of time. The fog parted before her, and she knew he was here. Out of the mist, the plague doctor emerged. His long, dark cloak swept across the ground, the beak of his mask catching the faint light as he moved with the eerie grace of a shadow come to life. He stepped forward slowly, deliberately, as if savoring each moment. Alice's pulse quickened, but she stood her ground, clutching the mask tightly in her hands. "You won't take me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat. "I know what you are." The plague doctor paused, his head tilting in that unnatural way, as if considering her words. His gloved hands hovered near his sides, motionless, yet radiating a sense of terrible power. Alice's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the force emanating from him, the centuries of death and darkness wrapped around his very being. But this time, she wasn't paralyzed by fear. This time, she had a weapon. "The mask," she said, her voice steady now. "It's the key, isn't it? You're nothing without it." For a moment, the plague doctor remained silent, his figure looming like a specter from another time. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he raised one gloved hand and pointed directly at her. The gesture was simple, but it was enough. Alice felt a wave of cold dread wash over her as the temperature in the air plummeted. She could hear faint whispers, distant and echoing, growing louder with each passing second. The souls he had claimed were all around her, their presence pressing in like a suffocating fog. But Alice didn't back down. She lifted the mask in her trembling hands, holding it out in front of her. "If I destroy this, I destroy you." The plague doctor took another step forward, his movements fluid, but something had changed. The air around him shimmered, flickering with dark energy. His eyes, if there were eyes behind that mask, seemed to bore into her, weighing her very soul. Alice gritted her teeth. She couldn't hesitate. If she waited too long, he would claim her just as he had claimed the others. With a sharp breath, she pulled out the flint from her pocket and struck it against the stone. The spark caught, igniting the edge of the cloth wrapped around the mask. The flames licked at the worn leather, and for the first time, Alice saw the plague doctor react. His figure jerked, his head snapping to the side as if in pain. The whispering voices around her rose to a cacophony, their cries echoing through the fog, begging to be released. Alice's heart raced. She had to see this through. The fire consumed the mask, the leather curling and blackening as the ancient symbols etched into it began to glow. The air around her grew heavy, thick with the oppressive weight of centuries of death. The plague doctor's hand twitched, and for a brief moment Alice thought he might strike her down, but instead, he faltered. His dark form shimmered, wavering as the mask burned away, his power unraveling before her eyes. With one final burst of energy, the mask crumbled to ash in her hands. A scream tore through the air, not from Alice, but from the plague doctor. It wasn't a sound made by any human throat, but a low, guttural wail that seemed to come from the very earth beneath her feet. His figure began to fade, the black cloak dissolving into the mist, his form shrinking as the darkness peeled away. Alice stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The fog swirled around her, thick and suffocating, but the weight that had pressed down on her was lifting. She could feel it. Souls, countless souls being released from his grasp. Their whispers faded into the night, leaving only silence behind. When the fog finally cleared, the plague doctor was gone. The square was still and quiet, the air cool against Alice's skin. She looked down at the pile of ash where the mask had once been and let out a long, shuddering breath. The curse had been broken. The souls of Braxton were free. But as Alice stood alone in the empty square, she couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness wasn't truly gone. The plague doctor's presence had been woven into the very fabric of Braxton for centuries, and though his mask had been destroyed, something ancient still lingered. A reminder that some curses never die.